And thank you so much to all of you for the invitation to come to Prague. I think also for us, it's the most important thing to have some exchange with colleagues from all over the world, to exchange knowledge and to connect our scene, which is interested in bicycles and improving condition for bicycles. Well, my name is Michael Liebi. I'm the head of office for bicycle and pedestrian traffic of the city of Bern in Switzerland. I'm quite new in this job. I started in April 2018, but I worked for the city as a private planner in a private company for more than 10 years, so I know a lot of the projects and the planning guidelines for the city of Bern. I start with my presentation with the postcards of our city, because I think postcards, they say a lot of the picture, not only the picture for the tourists, but also the picture of the city which we have about ourselves. And the picture of the postcard picture of Bern is what you can see here in the background. It's the medieval old town, of course. It's the cathedral. It's built up on a hill in a loop of a river, approximately 50 meters above the river, with the hilly topography in the background. There's a lot of hills and forests, etc. It's a medium-sized city. 140,000 inhabitants. The metro area has a little bit more. With the suburbs, it's more or less like 400,000 inhabitants. It's UNESCO heritage as well. I point this because some people say it's not possible to build new infrastructure inside the UNESCO heritage. I don't think so. It is a hilly city, definitely, and it's the capital of a mountainous country. And I think also this is an important point for the stories we tell about of our city. One of the typical postcard picture of my city is this one. You can see the old town, a narrow, hilly old town in a hilly topography, and of course the mountains, the snowy mountains. It looks like they are quite close, quite nearby to the city. And I think that's the picture we have as Swiss people about our country, and of course that's what you want to see, I guess, when you come to Switzerland: the mountains, the hills, the old towns, etc. But is it really the reality? I would ask, because what you also can see here is it is difficult for bicycles. So that's the message of this picture. It's almost impossible to make a cycling city with this picture when you look at it. And indeed, a lot of things of the postcards are true. The topography is true, that the mountains, they are somewhere 80 kilometers far away. You can see them, of course, but they're not inside the city. And you can also see we have, of course, infrastructure which helps to solve traffic problems, like the bridges. But what I would like to point out is that this picture, this postcard picture, this is maybe like 5% of our city. 5% of the population lives in this old town. And indeed, it's not easy to make a good cycling city with this situation, because yeah, it is hilly, it is narrow. You cannot build new cycle tracks inside the medieval old town, but it's only 5%. The other 95% of our city structure, it's like almost every other European mid-sized city, a lot of flatter neighborhoods, a lot of infrastructure, highways, rails, a lot of urbanism from the 20th, 19th or 20th century. And so the question is actually, where do the people live? They do not live in the old town, of course. They live in neighborhoods from the 20th century, from the 19th century, and they have more or less, I guess, the same dimensions like other neighborhoods in other European cities. So I think the picture for which we have about ourselves, it's not really the reality. It's not more difficult to make a bicycle city with this like in other countries in Europe. And one of the other question is, how do the people come from the neighborhoods to this hilly and narrow city center? They don't have to cycle down to the river and up again, because more than 100 years ago, a lot of bridges were built, and we can use them for cycling as well. So still, they are not really flat. You have to cycle uphill when you go this direction, but it helps a lot. And of course, when you go for a swim in the river or on these neighborhoods down here, it is steep, but it's only a few % of the structure of the city. So the question remains, is it really that hilly and narrow, our city? I think on one hand, yes, because it is located 500 meters above sea level. The river is 500, the city center is maybe 550, and some of the suburbs, they go up to 700. So we have more or less in our city region 200 meters of differences in height. But the other question is it too hilly and too narrow for a good cycling infrastructure? And I think when we look at one of these bridges here, one of the main bridges, main entrances into the inner city, it's definitely not hilly and it's definitely not narrow. It's just a lot of space taken by the motorized traffic. So I make a comparison between one of the most important bridges in Copenhagen to the inner city, the Dronning-Louise's-bro, and our most important bridge to the city center, the Lorrainebrücke. And I ask myself which bridge is actually wider and which is maybe more difficult to build good cycling infrastructure. And I don't know really exactly, but I think they have more or less the same size. So it is not a question of space, actually, to build a good cycling infrastructure. In a lot of cases, it's just a question of how do we divide our public space. In our example, we have 4 lanes for motorized traffic to go with the car inside the city center. In Copenhagen, they rebuild it. They just have 2 lanes and a broad, wide cycle path, and also, of course, wide paveways on the side. So that brings me to the point that it is important which narratives do we tell. I think this is the starting point. Before building infrastructure, before make a cycling strategy, is we need the right, the good narratives, which helps us. And of course, I think some of you know Heidi, the fairy tale of the girls of the Alps. And that's actually not only for tourists, but also for ourselves, one of the main narratives which we have about our country. It's mountainous, it's the girl in the mountain. So it's not really an urban country, it's a difficult environment for cycling. But it's not reality, it's a fairy tale. I guess reality is this one here, just a normal bridge in a normal European city, and we can make it cycle friendly, I guess. Now I would like to tell a brief history of mobility policies in Bern, because I think you need to understand the history of mobility policies to get the point where we are now, or where we want to go further. When I look back to the 1930s, 40s or 50s, Bern was like, I guess, many other European cities. It was a cycling city. I found some pictures in the archives that very much looks like Copenhagen or the Netherlands, with a lot of cyclists on the streets. It was like the mass transport system, that the normal way to get around in the city was to take a bike, because public transportation exists, of course, but for normal people it was quite expensive to use public transportation. And nobody had a car, of course, in this time. So we can look back on a strong tradition, actually, of cycling, but more or less in Bern it disappeared. So it disappeared actually in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, like it's the normal story, like many other European cities as well, of course. The car-centric city planning came. There was plans to make like highways through the historic center because they thought it's good for economy to bring all the car traffic inside the city center, and parts of it were built of this system, and of course it didn't work with the car traffic in the historic center. It's a picture of the railway square in the, I don't know, 60s, I guess, when I look at the cars, and it was a huge chaos this time. And this led in the 1980s, especially, to this picture here. In these times, we needed a lot of space for car traffic. Also in a mid-sized city, it's not that big like your cities is, but also in a mid-sized cities, we had huge problems with car traffic, and we needed a lot of space, especially because then with so much car traffic, you need separation of the public transportation, because otherwise it would stuck in the traffic jam, the public transportation. And this huge amount of car traffic, of traffic at all, this led to a downgrading of the city, actually. Nobody would like to live beside such a dense traffic street. And what happened since then? It was a political change in the 1980s, primarily, when people fight for their streets, fight for quality of living in the city. There was a political change since then. It started mainly, I guess, in the neighborhoods, not on the main roads, that the people fought for better street quality. And since then, we introduced a lot of 30 km or also 20 km zones in the neighborhoods, so we can gain back public space on streets, and people started to like again to live in the city, because for many decades the population of the city was decreasing because it was not really attractive to live in the city. If you had enough money, you would go to the suburbs this time. And since the 1980s, mid-90s maybe, the trend changed and people came back to the city. And I think this quality of streetscapes with really cheap measures, it doesn't cost a lot to make some paint and banks, and so this was one of the main reasons why people like again to live in the city. And also, this picture is important to understand that the current cycling strategy, it has not much to do with cycling, but it is very important. Same street in the 1980s and the 1990s. In the 80s, the separation, a lot of lanes for car traffic, no space for pedestrians. And many of these main roads were rebuilt in the 1990s or early 2000 with mixed traffic between car traffic and public transportation. And this led to much more public space for pedestrians, for green, and also for cycling. It's not really comfortable here, but at least it exists. And of course, it was a struggle with the public transportation because they feared to stuck in traffic jams again. But in this case here, it is like prioritizing the public transportation, but not with space, but with green lights on the city's edge. So the car traffic is stopped on the city's edge when it's overcrowded, and then the tram can ride without traffic jam. And this is very important because it led to more space also for the bicycle. And of course, I have to say something about the public transportation system of Bern. Also, this is very important for a good cycling city, I guess. It's the alternative to have a car, this map here. It's a very dense public transportation network, like you also have, I guess. And this led to a percentage of 57% of car-free households in these years. it's not very practical to drive with the car to the city center, because do you have really a good public transportation network and not so much parking opportunities in the city center. So when we look at the inner city car traffic since the 1970s, we can find a decrease, especially since the mid-90s. It goes quite steep down. As I explained, a lot of car-free households in Bern, and this is a good starting point to make Bern a cycling city as well. One of the examples we realized a few years ago already was this. Another important point for gain space is, of course, the parking. It is used here for private parking for the residential areas, so not shops or something. And now, of course, because of the political change, it's possible to take away some parking space. And this street now looks this way with a cycle lane instead of the parking space. And it's not only a good thing for cycling, it's also important for public transportation, because in this picture here, the cyclists are in danger, of course, because of the doors and the traffic, but also the bus, it's an important bus line here, it's stuck behind the cyclists. And it's now much more better for cycling and public transportation as well. So nowadays we are here. We started 5 years ago or 8 years ago with 11%. It now increased to 15% in 2015, and our goal was to get to 20%. But I think we are going further. It's going faster forward with improving cycling, and I think we should have a new goal. We can definitely reach more than 20% till 2030. So back to the question, what narratives do we tell? The narrative we tell as that the cycling administration of Bern is, yes, we can make it like the Netherlands or Denmark. Because the old narrative was, no, it's not possible. We are Switzerland. It's too hilly, too mountainous. It's much more easier in Holland, but we don't think so. It is possible to make a cycling city like in the Netherlands or Denmark. And for this reason, we designed a new master plan, a new network of cycle routes, but also new standards and the whole new story of improving cycling infrastructure. The most important thing of the new standards is the wider cycle lanes or cycle tracks. In every new project, we try to reach the 2 meter 50 standards, because then you can overtake as a cyclist and you can ride next to each other. I think this is one of the main learnings from the Netherlands for me, that they have a social kind of cycling. You can cycle with your children or with your friend side by side. And in every case, we can remove parking. We immediately have 2 meters or more, so it's not impossible. And this is like the minimum. The minimum is the former minimum was actually this one. This the road cyclist, like me maybe, so the strong, the good cyclist. But it's not comfortable with 1 meter 50 for somebody who is not a good cyclist. So the absolute minimum for our standards are the 1 meter 80. And this is also a very important thing for us, for our new standard, the new solutions that they have to serve like 8 to 80. It's very important that also children and also elderly people are able to cycle, not only the pro cyclists like me, so I'm a road cyclist, I like road cycling. I'm not a good example. It's not good when I think about myself when I plan infrastructure. I have to think about the kids or the elderly people. Yes, and a very recent example of new infrastructure, new cycle lanes with 2 meter 50. Some people said it's not possible to make that in Bern. It's too narrow, but of course it's possible in a lot of places. Also with the reduction of this width here. In normal cases, it's only 3 meters. Maybe before it was 350, 380 because of national norms, etc. But the national norms, they're very depending on velocity of of the car traffic. And we also say that the velocity of car traffic must be more like 30 km in the inner city and not 50 or 60 even. So we can gain space when we narrow the lane of motorized traffic. And of course, cycle tracks are important for us. It's quite expensive to build it. You need projects. So I mean, this we don't need like a permission. We just can make it because it's only marking. But for this, of course, we need a permission to build it. And then some people can say, go to court. So it's expensive and takes some time. But of course, it's one of the major learnings from Copenhagen and the Netherlands that we have to build cycle tracks because they feel safer, like when you have this curb. We started to build it, but it's going slowly forward. But we have the first cycle tracks as well, with a good separation. We have some kind of older cycle tracks, or it's actually a cycle lane, but we will build it with a new curb here. That's a good separation from the pedestrians, also for the blind people, that they can see where the border of the cycle lane is. And also an important thing is the layout of the crossing. You can see on the left side the typical Swiss solution to make a left turn, and it means you have to go in the middle between those both lines. It's quite a critical, quite a difficult maneuver. It's possible for me again, but it's not easy for a child to do this. And then you go direct with the motorized traffic to the left turn. And so we added a new principle, which we know from Copenhagen, where you stay on the right side and turn left, not direct, but like indirect, with this street here, which we think is much more safer because you don't need to cross and you don't need to make this difficult left turn. Maybe you have to wait a little bit longer there. That could be. And also, of course, the Dutch style of infrastructure. Yeah, that's our current situation in Bern. Some example of the Copenhagen style left turn. We already made it, and I think it worked quite good. You're here separated on the right side, and on the next picture you can see pretty much like Copenhagen, the Copenhagen style left turn. Go a little bit faster because there's no much time left. So the question is, what about the topography when we build cycling infrastructure? And one of the main thing again is that the cycle lanes or cycle tracks must be wide enough to overtake. It's not that steep here, but the cyclists they have a very different kind of speed in this situation. So overtaking is very important, and we also need it because of increase of numbers of cyclists. Also important for public transportation, this separation and the broad line, that the bus can overtake the cyclists, because we want to improve both kind of transportation. Bike boxes are important because of topography, because at the red light you can overtake somebody and go in a head start when the cycle lane is narrowing again. And of course, the traffic lights. We made a kind of a green wave in the first route in Bern. And of course, it's not a green wave like the Netherlands or Copenhagen has, because we have topography. So we don't need like the median speed on flats, but we have different kind of speeds when it goes down. And we measured our cyclists, how fast they rode, not the e-bikes, but the normal bikes. Yes, and of course e-bikes, huge potential. I guess every second sold bike in Switzerland is an e-bike right now. So people really like it, and a lot of people start to cycle again thanks to e-bikes. But we have two categories, like maybe you have two. The normal ones till 25, no problem, very good thing. But also the fast ones, they can ride 45. And they are treated more or less in Swiss law like normal bikes. So they are on the cycle lanes, on the cycle paths. And that makes huge problems for us. So I don't recommend to make it like Switzerland with this. They are too fast. They are more like motorcycles. See. Yeah. I come to end. I think the bike sharing system we introduced this summer also has 50% of e-bikes, because it's an advantage when you go to the e-bike to the bike sharing system, that you can have an e-bike. It's a good alternative for public transportation. And as I explained before, we need alternatives. We can not only build cycling infrastructure, you need alternatives, and public transportation, I guess, is also very important. Well, one last thing, I guess. Culture and campaigning and the political support. I think I will make an end with this slide here. That was our executive members of the city. We have 5 executive members, and they all came to this picture when we started to have a new cycling strategy. And as you can see, 2 of them are smiling, 2 of them are neutral, and 1 guy has no bike. So this was the political, you can see the picture, but at least he came. So of course not everybody is happy with this, but it was the majority which decided to have a new cycling strategy. And I think that's finally the most important thing, is the strong and consistent and long-term political support. So, thank you very much.